In this video I'm going to show you the coil method of working with clay. First, cut yourself some fresh clay off of a block that we will use to make new coils. Be sure to seal the bag tightly so that your clay doesn't dry out. To begin making your coils, tap the piece of clay on your work surface. This will wake the clay up and start to get the particles moving. Sometimes these particles can become rather stiff sitting in the bag even though they're not drying out, and this tapping action will help increase the flexibility and plasticity of your clay. Next, begin squeezing the clay into a rough coil form just by using your hands and squishing it in your fists. Be sure to avoid adding large creases to the clay, so if you find a large crease forming, use your thumbs or other fingers to separate that out or seal that so that there's no weaknesses or air trapped in the middle. Be sure to work the whole piece of clay evenly so that all of the particles are of the same consistency and relatively the same thickness before you attempt to roll the coil. Once you're satisfied, begin rolling the coil, starting with your hands together and being sure to roll at least an entire rotation around the circumference of the coil. Be sure you have a nice clean workspace with plenty of room to extend the coil out to the sides. As your coil grows, you may even need to switch to a larger wear board or separate the coil in half and begin thinning it further in two separate pieces. Otherwise, the parts hanging off of the ends may develop undesirable textures and you may end up discarding those pieces anyways. One common issue that people have when rolling coils is that they'll develop a flat side to the coil and it will begin to bump as they try to roll it across their work surface. This is relatively normal, and so if it happens to you, just take some time to carefully press harder on the longer edge of the coil until you maintain a totally round coil. It is also important to focus your pressure in the palm of your hand rather than out on the fingertips. Although I use my fingertips to help roll the coil back and forth, most of the pressure in my rolling comes when my palm is over the coil, or the knuckles of the palm of my hand. I don't press very firmly when my fingers are on top of the coil, because this will lead to dents and inconsistencies. Moving your hands across the coil to focus on the thicker sections is very useful in maintaining a consistent thickness. You may find that certain sections need a lot more work than others, and this attention to detail will pay off later when we go to attach this onto our pot. As you can imagine, attaching an uneven coil to a pot is going to cause the pot to become uneven, so it is worth taking the extra time in this phase to ensure that you have the best starting coils from which to build your piece. These coils are relatively thick because I'm going to be building a large piece. So I would estimate that these are maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches thick. However, the piece I'm building will actually have quite thin walls because I will take some extra time to thin the walls after these coils are added. So there's no need to make extremely thin coils unless you would like to reveal the thickness of those coils on the surface of your pot, in which case you may want to consider the thickness as part of your design. Another method of making coils involves throwing them out. By tapping the clay on the table, we can actually encourage this piece to elongate and form more of a coil shape. This is a technique used by the ongi potters of Korea. It takes quite a lot of practice to feel comfortable using this technique, but it is amazingly satisfying when it is successful. You can see that by throwing the clay down at an angle, the tail end of the coil should hit the wear board first, and that will stick partially to the wear board and cause a stretching motion in the rest of the coil as it lays itself down. You may consider pausing the video partway through the throw to see this more clearly. If you have a thick spot in the coil, try to focus the throwing energy in that section to encourage that to thin out. However, An untrained hand can often cause thin spots in this method of coil making, so it is important not to push your clay too far. And for our purposes in this class, there will be no distinct advantage to learning to throw coils as opposed to roll them. Whichever method you choose, the goal is always consistency in both thickness and texture. Some people even prefer to extrude their coils using a clay extruder rather than make them by hand just for this reason. I like to make my coils by hand because it warms up my touch and gives my hands a sense of the texture of the clay, how far it's willing to be stretched. I'm folding my coils in half here to save space on my table. Be careful not to fold your coils too tightly or you will create weak spots in them. If you have room to store them in straight sections, this would be preferable. Be sure to wrap your coils tightly in plastic and tuck the corners of the plastic underneath the coils so that there's no chance of them drying out as you're working on the base. Placing your wearboard on a banding wheel or lazy Susan will help for this next step. Start making the base for your coil piece by cutting off a slab from your block and pounding it with the edge of your fist in a rotating manner. You want to compress the slab evenly on both sides and work from the center towards the outside, as this compression may move some of the clay and actually stretch the slab to be larger than you begin with. What you're going for here is even compression all the way through the piece and a relatively even thickness. This shouldn't be painful because you'll need to be using your hands a lot. Use the meaty part of the outside of your hand, as this should be relatively comfortable. You can also use a paddle, and the same principle applies. Begin in the middle and rotate the piece around so that you're compressing evenly throughout the slab. In general, I would like to leave about ½ inch of clay on the bottom of this piece, so I will have a base that's slightly thicker than the walls of my pot. When you are satisfied with the consistency and thickness of your piece, you can cut it out using the needle tool or a knife, and it helps if this is centered on your wearboard so that you can hold your hand steady and just rotate the piece underneath you to give a near perfect circle. Immediately place all the scraps back in your clay bag so that you don't end up doing more reclaim than is necessary. Before you add your first coil, peel the slab off of your wearboard and lay it back down gently. This will ensure that it's not stuck completely to the wearboard, and so when it shrinks, it can do so freely without stressing and cracking the base. Then reposition it to be sure it's in the center of your lazy Susan or banding wheel, so that it'll be easy to add coils in a regular fashion. Before adding your first coil, pinch the outer edge of the slab. This will compress the exposed edge of the slab and also begin to build up a small wall which will add to the surface area of our first coil attachment. This joint between the base and the first coil is critical and is often a little bit weak. It will be worth our time to pay extra attention to this first attachment and make sure that it's as strong as possible. Also take the time to maintain the rim of that pinched portion, making it even and compressed with no cracks or thick spots. If you have a mallet, you can consider tapping it gently around the outer edge to smooth that section and compress it even further. Using the scoring tool, begin by scoring the inner edge of that pinched rim of the base. Remember to score deeply, and you cannot score too deeply. We want this attachment to be extra strong. If both your coil and your base are fresh clay and have not dried out, there is no need to add slip at this stage. If you feel like one is slightly stiffer than the other, go ahead and add either a small amount of water or slip to ensure that that attachment is as strong as it can be. Next, score the edge of the coil that will be pushed into that connection. Again, score deeply and confidently. We can always smooth the surface after the addition is secure. I'm going to show you the addition of the first 2 layers of coils at normal speed, and then I will fast forward or skip through the later parts of the building process, because the same steps will be repeated at each layer. Once you have scored your coil, lift it carefully and rotate it so that the scored edge is meshing in with the scored portion of the base. Don't lay the whole coil in a ring around the surface and then pinch it into place, because as you pinch this coil, you will see that it expands and actually stretches and becomes longer than the original rolled coil. So it's important that you attach it in a zipper-like fashion, starting at one end and pressing it into the joint, working your way around the ring. Press the coil firmly in place and think carefully about the touch and pressure that you are using. This is the sort of muscle memory that you will need to build up over time working with clay. For now, the focus of your energy should be in getting the coil firmly attached to the base, not worrying about thickness or even regularity in the shape. When you've made a full rotation, come to the end and pinch off any excess clay. It's typically not worth the small benefit of continuing the coil up onto the second layer, because this can lead to unevenness in the form. That clay can be re-rolled into a new coil and used much more effectively. Now, do a second pass all the way around the ring, making sure that the coil is firmly attached at all sections. You can support the base with your other hand on the outside, and you can see here that I'm kind of pinching in from the outside as well as I'm pushing out from the inside. Next, I'm going around the ring with my thumb, making sure to move some of the clay downward and seal any crease that I see between the coil and the base. Just like with the pinch pot, we don't want any creases visible in our form. So, using your thumb on the inside and your fingers on the outside, you're going to work that clay from the coil down towards the base. And you can see with my other hand on the outside, I'm pinching that base up towards the coil. So really what I'm going for here is a double layer of clay, working the coil down into the base and then working the base up into the coil. It's worth here to take plenty of time to make sure that this is done well and is fully secured. Once I'm satisfied that the coil is firmly attached to the base and there's no creases visible, I'm going to switch my motion towards focusing on moving that base and the clay on the outside up into the outer surface of the coil. Here you can see that I've moved my body position so my thumb is now on the outside and is more able to move that clay. I tend to like to move clay with my thumbs more than my fingers because it's a stronger muscled digit and it's easier on my wrists and tendons. Coil building is a repetitive motion activity, and so it's really important to take care of your body. If you are feeling like your muscles are getting tired or cramping, take the time to stretch between adding different layers of coils. And it's generally nice to use the time when the piece is drying to do some other activity so you can give your hands a rest. This is especially important if you're just starting out and you haven't built up these specific muscles yet. Another issue can be table height. If you find yourself leaning over the table like I am here, you might find that that starts to hurt your back or shoulders. So if you need to raise your wearboard up on books or bricks or something else, or actually lower it towards the floor if you're up too high, it's worth taking that time to make your workspace comfortable and don't hurt yourself in this process. So now I'm satisfied that the clay from the base has been worked up into the wall, so there's no seam on the outside or the inside of that coil. And now I am going around and just maintaining the upper rim. Since some of the parts are thinner than others and some sections are taller than others, I'm just going around and compressing with my thumb downward on the top edge of the rim just to flatten it out, thicken it up, and make it even all the way around. This will be the base that we are going to attach our next coil onto, and so it's important that the top edge of that be as regular as possible. I'll speed up this process because it's rather repetitive, but essentially here I'm using my pinch pot techniques of collaring. So I'm pinching with both hands and squeezing my hands together, and that is forcing the clay to move straight upwards as it's thinning. So the pressure of my pinching is thinning out those clay walls, but rather than letting it flare out, I am bringing my hands together and forcing that clay straight upward. It's really important when building larger ceramic pieces to control the form early and not let it get out of hand, especially with overhangs. You generally want to get the height of your object established before you allow it to expand width-wise. So I'm going to take extra care to keep this vertical for now, and then I'll leave the walls thick enough that if I want to expand it outward or increase the curve or the overhang, I'll have a little bit of clay that I can stretch to give it a little more volume. So if you have a paddle and an anvil, now would be a time where you could start to use that as your process, and the paddle is just going to compress and smooth out that outer surface, kind of building off of the pinching motion. If you don't have one of these, that's totally fine. You'll just continue to pinch those walls until you're satisfied with the thickness. I'm going to sponge that upper rim to keep it workable, and then I'm going to go ahead and score that top edge in order to add my next coil. I'm going to score on the top edge and actually slightly down the inside of the wall, because I'm going to attach the coil on the inside of this upper rim. Again, that will just help me maintain the verticality of this piece and avoid it flaring out too much towards the outside. Now, in attaching the second coil, I will use the same process. I score the coil, and then I'm going to firmly press it into the scored section of the upper wall. I need to be careful to support the wall with the outer hand, because that coil I added is still wet underneath, and so the wall is quite fragile at this stage. If you support with the outer hand, it should be fine to go ahead and add this coil now. If you find that the wall is already too thin or too weak to support this next coil, it may be a sign that you need to reinforce it before you continue upward if you're making a larger piece. Just like on the first layer, I'm going to push firmly with my inner hand to seal the coil into the joint. And I'm not very concerned about the evenness or thickness of that coil at this stage. I'm just really concerned about it being firmly attached. If you need to score in additional sections, maybe that didn't get properly scored earlier, it's always good to have your tool handy and go ahead and just score it again if it need be. You can see here that I'm leaning the coil dramatically towards the inside of the pot. And that will help me maintain a vertical wall when I go to thin this out, because as I thin that coil, just like with a pinch pot, it will tend to flare outward. So by leaning it towards the center to begin with, I will have a lot more control over the ultimate form. Even if I want a form that flares outward, I will still add the coil leaning towards the inside. Again, I will discard any excess clay from that coil so I have a level rim to the top of the piece, which will make it easier to thin and keep even. Now I will work my way around the pot, smoothing out the joint on the inside, making sure it's firmly attached and that the creases are reinforced. And then I will do the same on the outside, working both the coil down into the rim of the pot and then smoothing the pot back up into the coil. Here, I'm using my thumb on the inside of the piece to smooth out that connection first. The other hand is supporting on the outside, but is not significantly altering the piece. All the action is really happening on the inner thumb. Sometimes you'll see people using this twisting motion as a way of sealing that joint. And that works because essentially the leading thumb is pushing downwards and the trailing finger is pulling the clay from the base back upwards. It doesn't tend to work well for me because it leaves deeper marks than I would like on the surface, so I'll just use the pads of my fingers on the outside now to smooth that coil down and seal up any creases that are visible. So here I'm supporting on the inside now, and most of the action is happening with my index fingers on the outside of the piece. You can see that the addition of that coil has significantly bulged out the form near the upper lip. And so now I'm going to do one rotation using the pinch and collaring method to bring that wall back into a vertical shape. Again, as I pinch and then bring my two hands together, that will force the clay upwards rather than outwards. And then it's important to maintain that upper rim again between each addition of a coil, so that you have a smooth and consistent surface to build from. If you are just working with pinching and not a paddle, this will be your main method of thinning and reshaping the walls. So now that you've added this extra clay, you have the ability to make it into any form that you'd like, basically working with a large pinch pot. So some of you may be making forms that are not round, and this is a good stage at which to emphasize different shapes. It's also important to not over thin these walls at the lower section if you're going to add more and make a taller piece. In that case, these lower sections of the walls may need to be slightly thicker to support that extra weight. Here I'm aiming for something between 1/4 and 1/2 of an inch thick. If you are not working with the paddle and anvil method, but you would still like a smooth surface, you can use your ribs to smooth one of the walls while supporting from the opposite side with your other hand. If you are smoothing the piece using a rib, Try to avoid adding excess water, as this could weaken the walls and extend the drying time necessary before you add your next coil. Some water may be necessary to get the texture that you want, just don't overdo it. When you're satisfied with the basic thickness and shape of your wall, you may need to let it dry before adding the next one. In this case, my wall is already too thin to sufficiently support an additional coil until I let it stiffen up a little bit. So I've added a little bit of water just to the upper rim and made sure that there are no visible cracks in that rim. And now I'm going to wrap tightly just that exposed rim section so that it stays wet enough to add an additional coil, while at the same time leaving the bottom section of the wall exposed so that it can dry out, adding stiffness and structure to the piece that will allow me to add additional coils. On this day, I let it sit outside for an hour, and it was sunny and windy, so that exposed section dried very quickly, and I was able to come back and score to add the next coil. The weather has a major effect on drying times, so if your piece is not drying out as quickly as mine, you may need to just wait longer or resort to something like a hair dryer to speed that drying process. If you choose to use any heat or fans, be sure to do so evenly across the piece and to be really careful to avoid overheating any plastic or other wrapping materials that may be on the piece. You can see here I'm adding my third coil in the same fashion as I did the first two, leaning it significantly towards the inside, pinching off any excess clay, and taking several laps around the coil to make sure that it is securely attached before I attempt to thin or shape the wall. Even if you would like the individual coils to be visible in your final piece, it's important to smooth at least one side of the wall, either the inside or the outside, because this will add a significant amount of structure to the piece. If you are unfamiliar with scoring and slipping, or the pinch and collar method, building a large coil piece is a great way to learn and train your hands with some muscle memory for these processes. Sometimes you can add more than one coil at a time between drying sessions, but this will depend on how soft your clay is, how thin your walls are, and how complicated your form is. So don't rush it and make a reasonable assessment about how much clay you can add at once. Be sure to maintain the rim before you walk away for a drying session. And always wrap the rim so that you have a workable surface to come back to. Once you've added several coils and gone through several drying stages, you may start to find that the base of your pot is already approaching leather hard, while the top rim is still workable, and this is great for stability, but you don't want the base of your piece to dry out beyond the leather hard stage. So at some point you may need to start wrapping the base and the rim while leaving the middle section of the wall exposed. You may also need to periodically spritz down the base using your water sprayer. At every layer, the process is the same. Score, attach firmly, secure the attachment, thin and shape the walls, continue shaping the walls, address the texture, and then wrap and let dry before the next coil.